My name is Lisa Supenko, and I'm the CEO of Kesselheim Scientific. Good afternoon, good morning to those of you joining from the US. Good evening for those of you joining from Asia. We have a very special event today on a very, very hot topic. And if you've been following the news or not following or opening any newspaper, there has been a lot of very loud headlines about Alzheimer's disease and about Alzheimer's drugs. And we received a special request to host this event and to answer some questions. There's a lot of information right now in the press, and there are a lot of questions, particularly because of the imminent approval of the new drug from Eisai. So 55 million people suffer from dementia worldwide based on WHO estimates, and 60 to 70% of them suffer from Alzheimer's disease. And the current definition of Alzheimer's disease is characterization of Alzheimer's disease is the presence of beta amyloid plaques in the brain. And right now, over 4,000 clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease are found in the registries. These might be terminated trials, ongoing trials, completed trials. And right now, about 120 new potential medicines are in development. Unfortunately, to date, every phase 3 trial studying a disease-modifying drug has failed. And it's been incredibly disappointing for all parties involved, for the research community, for basic researchers who are questioning the actual models for targeting the disease, to the participants of the trials, to clinicians, but most importantly, to patients and carers. And this is an extremely important topic, which in one way or another will concern all of us through our lives. However, over the last few years, the landscape has been changing. And we've got some new drugs that we want to talk about now. So Biogen made huge headlines a few years ago. It received accelerated approval from the FDA in July of 2021. And in December 2021, it actually received a refusal for marketing authorization from the European Medicines Agency. So this drug is available on some terms in the United States, and we'll discuss that, and it's not available in Europe. It was studied in 2 phase 3 trials, one of which was negative, and very controversial evidence package. Both studies were stopped prematurely because of interim analysis suggested they were not going to meet their endpoints. And now, fortunately, there is a phase 4 confirmatory trial, but results are far away. The second drug is lecanemab from Eisai, which we received an accelerated approval from the FDA in January 2023. And the decision on this drug is imminent from the FDA. European Medicines Agency is expected to make the decision in the first quarter of 2024. And the results of this trial, of phase 3 trial Clarity, is what we'll be talking about today as well. And finally, the donanemab, which is slightly further away, did not receive accelerated approval from the FDA, but it may enter the market soon as well. The results are based on the phase 3 Trailblazer trial. So today, we put together an exceptional panel for you. We have Professor Aaron Kesselheim from Harvard Medical School. We have Professor Frank Harrell, statistician from Vanderbilt University. We have Professor Peter Whitehouse, who is the clinician from Case Western Reserve University. And we have Dr. Richard Oakley, who's joining us from the UK Alzheimer's Society. And I will be chairing today's event. So before I pass it to our panel, just a few points. We do have a very interesting discussion planned for you. However, we would love to engage you as the audience. So if you have questions for the panelists, please raise your hands, and the best way you can reach our experts is raise your hand, turn on your camera, and I'll invite you to ask the question. Alternatively, you can put questions in the chat, but depending on the traffic of questions, let's see what I'll manage to pick up. So without further delay, I would like to now invite Professor Aaron Kesselheim to introduce himself.
Hi, well, thanks for inviting me to this panel. My name's Aaron Kesselheim. I'm a primary care doctor and a lawyer and a professor of medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where I run a research group called the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law, and am a faculty member in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics, which is a division within the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. So I care for patients with Alzheimer's disease in my primary care practice, and I have been involved in this field as a member of the FDA Peripheral and Central Nervous System Advisory Committee that reviewed aducanumab, and I was a member of it from 2015 until 2021, when I resigned in the wake of the FDA approval decision, because I felt like it was the wrong decision and that the process, the advisory committee process, was not being used optimally in that and other circumstances that I'd observed. So I resigned. So I'm glad to be a part of this conversation today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Aaron. Frank, please go ahead.
I'm Frank Harrell. I'm a professor of biostatistics at Vanderbilt University, which is in Nashville, Tennessee. I also work part of my time with the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, but I'm coming today strictly in my university role. I have a long time interest in clinical trials design and analysis and interpretation, and I'm very interested in clinical outcome scales and their clinical interpretation and making outcome scales more clinically relevant. And I have several concerns about that. And I think I may bring a fresh perspective because I'm unburdened by any experience with Alzheimer's clinical trials. My work has been in cardiovascular and critical care medicine primarily, but I'm very glad to be here today.
Thank you so much, Frank. Peter, please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry to be off camera, but delighted to be with you. I'm a geriatric neurologist that have been practicing for over 30 years, taking care of people with these kinds of conditions, although I'm working more in public health because I think we have some really hard social decisions to make about where we invest in brain health. I was involved on the FDA panel when the first round of drugs were approved, the cholinesterase inhibitors, several decades ago, and involved in the development of some of the instruments that we use today to still assess patients and try to determine whether these drugs are efficacious. So thank you very much again for the invitation. I look forward to the questions as well.
Thank you, Peter. Richard.
Yeah, hey everyone. So I'm Richard Oakley. I'm the Associate Director of Research and Innovation at Alzheimer Society. So that's the biggest charity in the UK focused on dementia. So we fund a portfolio of research, trying to help academics and clinicians fund research, but also trying to help small startups who have good products, but maybe need access to people affected by dementia to make sure their product is really focused on the needs of people with dementia. So we have a group of about 16,000 people living with dementia and carers who we kind of partner up with academics in order to help their research develop. And we also have a huge influencing arm where we try and work with the UK government to try and make sure they're listening to the voice of people affected by dementia to make sure our policies are relevant and focused on the people at the center of everything we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you so much for your introductions. And to kick off the discussion, I would like to invite our experts to share their personal opinions on the current situation with these new Alzheimer's drugs coming to the market. What do you make out of the headlines? What is your personal opinion on potential of these drugs being used in the market? And as you see, our audience is, our panel is very much US based, but I also very happy to have Richard from the UK, and we're happy to hear questions across the board, not just focused on the US perspective. So Aaron, maybe you can start.
Sure. So, my opinion, which I expressed also at the advisory committee for aducanumab, is that there did not appear to be good evidence that aducanumab had efficacy There was a large trial that was conducted and stopped when at the interim analysis point. At that point, the two trials making up that combination review were then separated, and one of them appeared to be positive, and in the high dose arm, the other was negative, and so there was conflicting evidence at best that drug had efficacy, and in that circumstance, it made sense to continue to try to test it to determine if the efficacy was real, and not to rely on post hoc analyses of the trial to try to make a clear determination about the drug. In addition to that, of course, there was the very substantial risks associated with the drug. Upwards of 35 to 40% of patients had brain swelling or bleeding, which was well controlled in the context of the clinical trial. But I think that there was a lot of concern at the advisory committee that in outside of the context of the very closely monitored and clinical trial setting, that risk would have presented a very substantial population level risk to patients. And so, in the context of unclear evidence of the drug works and clear evidence of a very substantial risk, it didn't make sense to me to approve the drug. And it certainly didn't make sense to price the drug initially at $56,000 a year, which if even 10% of patients on Medicare in the US would have gotten the drug, we would have spent more money on it than we spend on the entire budget of NASA for just that one drug. The manufacturer recognized that craziness after a little while and cut the price in half. But really, at any price, a drug that doesn't work and has substantial risks is not a good idea. Lecanemab is a slightly different story. Lecanemab does have a trial that is positive, although it is very marginally positive. The amount of difference after 18 months of therapy on the clinical scale that was used is very meager. The risks of lecanemab are less than the risks of aducanumab. The rate of area of brain swelling and bleeding is less, so the risks are slightly lower. And in that context, the FDA thought it was appropriate to do accelerated approval, and it looks like the FDA is going to give the drug full approval in July. That drug is also priced at a very high level, and it will be incumbent on physicians and patients at that point to have clear conversations about what people can actually expect on this drug. Particularly since these are otherwise patients with very mild cognitive impairment, who might otherwise still be very independent. And we just don't know a lot of things about lecanemab, about the effect on things that matter to patients like institutionalization or independence. We don't know if this very small effect after 18 months of therapy is the most effect you'll ever see, or if that effect continues to progress. There's still a lot of questions about this drug, but it does look like it is on more sure footing clinically than aducanumab was, and for those reasons, I think that it is. Most people believe that the drug will get approved in the this summer.
Thank you for this comprehensive overview, Aaron. I'd like to give word to Peter now to either reflect what Aaron has said or just share your perspective as a clinician, and perhaps address a very specific question of the population that all three drugs are meant to target. And the comment that Aaron made about these being relatively fit people with early signs of Alzheimer's and potential side effects for them of these drugs.
So as usual, I agree with what Aaron said, and this time and elsewise, and congratulate him for his courage. He actually participated with me in a panel of experts who suggested that the FDA actually withdraw aducanumab. because the lessons we learned from that was the malignancy of the politics associated with these compounds, the fact that people exaggerated and distorted data, and this involved, congressional criticism. So it was a debacle, as I would refer to it. So that those politics and those conflicts of interest still exist. Let me say a couple of different things. I don't believe the amyloid hypothesis actually is a hypothesis. It's more a political statement. Rudolf Virchow, who described amyloid back in the late 1800s, essentially then went into social medicine and said that, medicine is just politics at a different scale. Naito-san, the president of Eisai, who I've had the personal opportunity to meet, said that his drug proved the amyloid hypothesis. Because the question is, what is the amyloid hypothesis? What is the proof? Did the approval of tacrin, an cholinesterase inhibitor, and Eisai's Aricept prove the cholinergic hypothesis? No, these are statements that frame the conversation in ways that aren't helpful. Another, and I'll conclude and answer your question, about the mild cognitive impairment, early dementia. We also tend to misconstrue things when it comes to diagnostic labeling. The concept of mild cognitive impairment is actually quite controversial. And now we have another diagnostic label, subjective cognitive decline. So this is a continuum. So is mild cognitive impairment early dementia, or is early dementia different than mild cognitive impairment? So the problem with this is that people with mild cognitive impairment, by definition, don't have any impairments or very mild impairments in activities of daily living. So they're really not yet affected by the disease and may not progress. People with MCI don't always progress to dementia. So we have a lot of diagnostic confusion that is partially clarified by biomarkers. And we have great concerns about giving these medicines to people very early in a process that I think is brain aging, where the side effects, as Aaron said, are significant and I think will be a much greater problem when it comes into greater use. So I'm skeptical about the value for society.
Peter, thank you so much for these comments. And I'd like to hear the response from Richard on the perspective of what's going on in the Alzheimer's community with patients and carers who are desperately waiting for a solution. And currently, you can see a lot of headlines, even echoing the results of the Eisai trial, saying, if I get those 5 extra months to be like I am now, I want to have those 5 extra months and not to progress. Are we getting those 5 months, or is this data massaging, to which I'll get to Frank in a moment and then back to Peter. But Richard, please, what would be your perspective?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think we're taking a strong stance in the UK. We're not trying to lobby the MHRA or EMA or NICE to make a decision. We want to give them the time and allow them to look at the data, make the decision and make the recommendations, and then we will respond accordingly. But I think what we've been talking about a lot is that the first treatments for any condition are not the ones that you'd like to hope for. I hope and I believe further treatments will come along. So the question for me is, can these treatments be a stepping stone? And like I say, I have to defer to colleagues who are sitting on the panels at MHRA. But if we look into things like cancer, the first chemotherapies came through, had awful rave reviews. If we look at things like MS and conditions like that, the first treatment showed similar slowing in their first clinical trials. Interferon beta was 33% slowing of decline, but we know in real life it was much larger. So we are hopeful, and I think absolutely, who is to say what is clinically meaningful? A part of me says that it should be an informed decision by the patients. A clinician and a patient should sit down. There are absolutely risks. The risks are huge for any treatment if it's unmanaged. And Aaron mentioned in the clinical trial as well, managed. That is very different, obviously, in the population. Of course it is. But we saw with conditions like MS, particularly in the UK, the entire diagnosis system was remodeled to ensure that people could get interferon beta. And the moment in the UK, we have 62% of people getting a diagnosis of dementia. no time frame, no accuracy. So we accept that a third of people don't even get one. And if this can be a step towards us getting people an actual diagnosis at an early stage, I think that would be a really good one. But that is only if the evidence and the data that comes from, and if MHRA is allowed, which is the UK equivalent of the FDA, is allowed to look at the data and the experts make that decision. But I coming from other conditions where in cancer we can extend life for 3 months or 6 months, and we celebrate that. I would like a little bit more talk around the positives and the progress we have made, where there's been nothing for 20 years, and in 6 months we had 2, we think, positive trials, but we await those conditions. That has to be seen as a sign of progress. And we want to talk to our politicians around how they should get involved, because they have always told us why there's nothing you can do. And I'm just really worried that we carry on that narrative, and actually the narrative is we can do something, we are doing things, we are making progress. And I think that's a good positive message, but we have to make sure it's the right treatments at the right time. And that's why we have to defer to my colleagues to make that decision and tell us if that's right.
Thank you, Richard. And I really liked your comparison of comment to cancer, how getting extra 8 weeks of progression-free survival, or with lucky overall survival, gets the registration of the drug at the FDA and the 100K price tag per year. And a very, very interesting parallel. Thank you. Frank, please go ahead.
Couple of random comments, just speaking about Aduhelm. If you look at all of the spheres in which people are looking at treatments and medical procedures and business, only with the regulated medical environment where you have a 2-trial rule do people continue to try to look at 2 trials separately and say, did they pass a certain bar? And I think in every other field, the common sense approach would be to say, if you have 2 trials that are almost identical to each other, and the 2 trials used to support Aduhelm were uncannily similar to one another, that the best estimate of the drug's effect is to average the 2 trials. So if FDA wasn't involved, I'm sure most anyone would do that in their interpretation of the 2. These are averageable trials because they're almost interchangeable. And so the result from one trial probably overestimated the efficacy and the other one probably underestimated it. But I think the average and the confidence interval that goes with that would be very reasonable. The other comment, much different from that, is that we have lots of experience in other fields, such as in medical rehabilitation and spinal surgery. So in spine surgery, where I've had a lot of research experience, there's a lot of great data collected about what matters to patients. So patients with back injuries, they have very serious issues. It's very debilitating. But if you ask patients what matters to them in terms of the success of their treatment 1 year after spinal surgery, what matters to them is where they end up. How they got there is completely irrelevant to patients. So they don't care about trajectories. They care about the final result a year after surgery. And they interpret that independently of the starting point of their amount of debilitation. So if that carries over to Alzheimer's research, then what I'm left with is a great disappointment in what I've seen so far in say, the papers that you sent around, Lisa, in that Alzheimer's research failed to correct the problems that are so common in clinical trials with patient outcome scales, in which it's taken for granted that the change from baseline is a relevant measure that captures what's important to patients. And I'd go so far as to say that the measurement scale that's used as the primary outcome in these trials, it seems to be well established and validated, but the change from baseline, I would be very surprised if that's ever been validated to have the right, to capture the right thing. And I'm pretty sure you can invalidate it with not much data, because it has floor and ceiling effects. So things that have floor and ceiling effects, it's a restricted range from 0 to 18. When you have a floor and ceiling effect, the change from baseline means something different depending on where you started. So you can't really interpret the result clinically in any meaningful way. It's something that could have been corrected early on in Alzheimer's disease research, but the clinical trial designers chose to follow tradition where this approach has been used in countless other medical fields and treatments, unfortunately. And so I'm disappointed that that problem was not corrected. And so the result is the clinical interpretation of what's the value to patients is, to me, very, very cloudy. Talking about a mean change from baseline when you cannot interpret that change without knowing what the baseline was may mean in effect that that mean change from baseline only applies to patients who started at the mean on baseline, not in general. And so there's a lot of issues where the analysis and the interpretation of these trials could be way more clinically relevant to patients than they have been analyzed to date.
Thank you so much, Frank. And I'm looking forward to the questions from the audience. So feel free to raise your hand to ask your question. And while we are waiting for your questions, I think we started this discussion already, but I'd like to share the 3 slides summarizing the actual results of these trials and what they mean on the talking through these results and the meaning on the scales would be an important next step before we receive your further questions. So just 1 second. So if we start with the aducanumab, I invite either Peter or Frank to comment on what it means, the results of the eMERGE trial of the difference of 0.39 and the 22% decrease.
Why don't I mention the clinical scale itself as the clinician and ask Frank to comment about the statistics. This is a scale that's been used for a long time. It basically has 3 ratings: 0, questionable, or no evidence; 1, mild dementia; 2, moderate and severe. So it's based on 0 to 3. But then there are 6 domains in which the clinician is asked to evaluate how the patient is doing in that arena. So 6 by 3 gives you the 0 to 18 that you're seeing on the slide. I would say to you that after the introduction of the CDR, as it's called, 0.5 became mild cognitive impairment. So they kind of inserted the condition that I mentioned is somewhat controversial as 0.5. The issue that I think is relevant is how do you take a score on this and convert that into months of additional life? From my mind, those claims are really unsubstantiated and exaggerations beyond what the data allows us to really draw. And as Aaron said, we don't really know what happens after 18 months. And I would like to say one last thing before I ask Frank to come on with the statistics. Richard, I think we can do things for people with dementia, with mild cognitive impairment. There is dementia friends, there's art, there's music, there's dance. There are preventing further decline by exercising and helping. So this is not a case of we do have a drug, we don't have a drug. It's a question of what's the relative value of any drug compared to all the other good things we can do for people with dementia, in my opinion. So I don't like to say that it's not treatable. It's not, we may not have the drugs we want, and I certainly agree with you there. But there are other social approaches that are equally important, or more important perhaps, than these drugs that have such a minimal effect, as Frank's already mentioned. So Frank, do you want to elaborate on that, or over to you?
I can elaborate on part of it. I think a scale that, such as this one, that has a 0 to 18 or 0.5 to 18 range, when you look at the components of the scale, it seems to be quite reasonable and seems to have a lot of face validity. The problem is the scale is not being analyzed the way it was derived. It's being tortured using subtraction. And so this is the sort of scale, if you analyze it statistically, you'll find that subtraction doesn't actually work in this context. So just numerical subtraction of a scale that's not blood pressure, an interval scale measurement like blood pressure, you can actually subtract. But a scale like this doesn't work with subtraction. So you're actually making it very hard to interpret and violating a bunch of statistical assumptions, which no one seems to have checked in any of the analyses that have been published, such as a normality assumption. Once you take the scale and put it into intervals, you're taking a scale that has some promise and then immediately ruining it by labeling things as mild, moderate, or severe. I think that's a very dangerous practice. It's very misleading. It loses a lot of information. It's not respectful of the scale and how the scale was created. So those categories just get in the way of understanding. And then there's one final problem with the research done to date. Well, when you talk about 36% slowing of decline, I don't know that means anything. And I don't think percentages work well, percent changes work well on this sort of scale. But the other problem, and this is a very subtle one, is we've already talked about side effects such as brain swelling. When you ask, how would you do an analysis that incorporates a benefit risk trade-off, which is all important to do? How do you do that when the scale is a change from baseline? There's no way to equate a certain change from baseline with a certain amount of brain swelling. But there is a hope of equating a certain absolute outcome of the patient on a 0 to 18 scale with brain swelling. So if you respect the scale, not only do you get more clinical relevance, but you're able to do a risk-benefit trade-off to get a net clinical benefit analysis that would penalize for brain swelling over time. And so the difference between two ordinal scales is no longer ordinal, and you cannot equate it with certain side effects, whereas the absolute scale is something you could base a comprehensive risk-benefit analysis on. So I think I've covered enough points there. Just anytime people subtract baseline, it's usually highly, highly problematic. And I'm disappointed the FDA is still allowing that to be done.
Thank you very much, Frank. You have an excellent question from Jack Scannell. And Richard, I'll give you a chance as soon as I read Jack's question, because it's completely related to what Frank just described. So Frank's endpoint scale clinical relevance comments strike me as relevant across a wide range of diseases. Are there therapy areas where improved disease measures have made a real difference? Who has the right incentives to break the inertia here? And I can understand why companies are reluctant to take risks with new scales. Frank, any comments?
I don't have any direct examples, but we have learned an amazing amount with COVID-19, where the patients, it's short-term follow-up, unlike Alzheimer's, but a lot of the issues come to the fore. And what we've been able to show is if you have a disease severity measure, such as the WHO COVID-19 outcome scale, and if you treat that as longitudinal and ordinal, you get so much more power than using traditional analysis, which is usually based on an oversimplified idea of time to recovery. So just trying to estimate the time to recovery for each patient and using that one number is a different issue than what we're talking about here. But the power of that compared to the power of using all the raw data, which means you get your hands on all of the longitudinal measurements, and however often the patient was measured on the outcome scale, you use all of those measures and you don't subtract baseline. So in the COVID sphere, we have lots of experience and lots of primary analyses based on optimal statistical analysis, and have been able to show you gain a lot of power in clinical interpretation, such as getting the what is the mean amount of time that a patient is in a certain state. So a state could be you're at a certain cognitive level or better, and that level or better could be 18 different levels. It could be not something you do just once. By estimating the time in cognitive level X or better, using all of the raw data and not using change from baseline, you can get a time-related clinical interpretation that has also optimum statistical power, which has great ramifications in terms of lowering the sample sizes that have been needed in the trials designed to date.
Thank you so much, Frank. So, Rich, you had your hand up, and then if you want to comment on anything that Frank has said, and then there is a question for you from Till Bruckner.
Yeah, and just to respond to Peter's perfectly a very good point. That there are absolutely things we can do to help you live better with dementia, but I mean, we are not changing the effect of the disease. So you still, on average, die within 7 years, and in the UK, it takes 2 years to get to diagnosis. And so that is part of the challenge we have, is that it takes so long currently, and there's no will in the system to change things. But to DMTs would. We've seen it with interferon beta, we've seen it with thrombolysis and stroke. When you look at those treatments that came through, they changed the diagnostic system. People got earlier and accurate diagnosis, either to or not to get to those treatments, and it changed the care landscape. And then these treatments that we're talking about, aducanumab aside, where obviously the FDA entire academic panel did not recommend it, which as I understand is different from the lecanemab now on the reduced panel. If we get these through, then we are going to hopefully see you have to get that early and a more accurate diagnosis, or even get a diagnosis, and that may change the care pathway. And then if you live longer, you'll still need more and more care and more support. So I think that's really important, that just to mention that that's part of the reason. It's not because these treatments are perfect, far from it, but we believe they will start the change in the healthcare system that currently, like I say, a third of people in the UK don't even get a diagnosis. And we believe this could be changing. Just the data you showed on the CDR Pharma boxes, I will defer to Frank and the experts to talk about that, but one stat I'm not holding up is the things what it meant for carers. So on different measures of care or quality of life, in lecanemab, one of them is 56% higher for carers with people who were on this treatment. In donanemab, it was 40% for people with dementia, still having conversations about current affairs, managing their finances, driving. These are some of the measures they're beginning to get in. And again, as I mentioned in MS, it was a similar slowing, but it actually equated to way more, because as we all know, these trials run for 18 months. We don't know what's going to happen. And there seems to be a lot of assumption that they may not be as effective after 18 months. But we don't know that. We don't know. They could be more. So and we're already seeing some benefits for carers and people affected. So again, I think it's really important that you are showing the sum of boxes, and is it clinically meaningful? Again, I think there has to be a conversation between clinician and a patient, in the same way some people choose not to have chemotherapy. They decide at their end of life, they can go away and have a holiday and have 6 months of good quality of life rather than 12 months or 18 months. And that is a decision of the patient to decide, do they want to go through that? Given the risks and the benefits to them, they make that informed decision. And again, providing it goes through the regulatory authorities, which has to be a really important caveat, that people like Aaron and others look at the data and tell us yes or no. Once that comes through, even if it's small, I don't think it's our right to say we're not going to offer it. It is our right to say the benefits are small, the risks are large, but it may do this. And that is your choice as the patient, decide if you or do you not want to do that. And I think that, combined with the changes to the healthcare system, I mean, these are really important moments in dementia.
Thank you very much, Rich. Very balanced and valid comments. Very important to take carer's perspective into account and this joint decision making. However, there's another part of the story, is the marketing of a pharmaceutical company and a very strong push by the market for cure in a promise, in the ability of the patients and clinicians very pragmatically and reasonably understand what's communicated, rather than take information from sales reps, and actually to have this very informed discussion. So Peter, I'd like to ask you a question or comment on what Rich just said. What do you think about this joint decision making? Where should it take place, and how should be dealt with these drugs versus the reality, especially in the US, where drug marketing might kind of surpass this step?
Was that a question for me? I'm sorry.
Yes, it was.
You broke out for a second. Well, certainly I think shared decision-making is at the core of the individual doctor or nurse and patient and family. So that is true. It is also true that the pharmaceutical industry spends an enormous amount of money in the United States and New Zealand, for example, with direct-to-consumer marketing, convincing people that these interventions are much more effective than they really have been demonstrated to be scientifically. So both points that you raise are important. I think at the middle of that is what I raised before and what Aaron also mentioned, at the community and the population health level. In the UK, you're more civilized. You have NICE, which does work on pricing. We have a very complicated system between the FDA and CMS, which I think we continue to try to change politically, because there's a social and a community and a population issue here, which is where do we want to invest our resources in keeping our brains healthy? Is the answer to Alzheimer's disease, or are there better approaches to focus on public health and care than these rather small effects? Effects that many in Europe who advise EMEA think are really not clinically significant. And I don't think, Richard, frankly, we can let any little things sneak through and then let individual patients and families to decide, because that space is why we have to do science in the first place. We have to respect that relationship, but we have to inform that relationship with science that really tells us this is something we as a society need to invest in.
Thank you very much, Peter. Aaron, I'd like to invite you to comment on the discussion we just had, plus on the slide, because US also has ICER, which was almost rooted from NICE.
Right, and I also want to just say that I really agree with Rich's comments. I thought that they were really sort of thoughtful about the need for high quality decisions and discussions between doctors and patients as after lecanemab, as most people assume will happen, gets approved. There is going to be a lot of pressure on those conversations, and as people who as policymakers, as people in the public health community, as people in our local institutions, we all need to try to take steps to try to ensure that those conversations are as informed as possible. Because when you ask someone, when somebody considers taking this product, they're going to need to think about the need to come in for multiple MRIs, the risk of infusion reactions, the possibility that every time they have they trip over a curb, then they might need to have another MRI to see if there's swelling going on, because it's hard to tell the difference between ARIA and sort of progression of disease. So I think that there is a lot that people are going to have to deal with, and it's going to be very important to get patients and clinicians accurate, unbiased information. And as you pointed out, Lisa, that can be a problem in the context of pharmaceutical promotion, not only the promotion direct to patients, but the $20 to $30 billion a year that the pharmaceutical industry spends promoting their drugs to physicians in ways that might overestimate the benefits and underestimate the risk. So I think that it's going to be really important to make sure that there is fair information out there about these products to try to ensure that patients can make as accurate a decision as possible. And then you wanted me to just talk about the pricing. The pricing issue, the reason that we have the pricing issue is because in the United States, we allow pharmaceutical companies to charge whatever they want for their drugs. ICER is, I like ICER. I like the people who run ICER. I think they do a good job, but they are a small nonprofit entity that does not have any real power, and has limited resources to undertake its analyses. And so I think that there should be an organization like ICER that operates on a national level to try to provide timely analyses of drugs and the prices that they're made available at, to try to understand what the relationship is between the drug's benefits and the price, and the impact on the budget for some of these drugs, because we can definitely get to a situation where payers have are challenged to provide other sorts of care if they're spending too much money or patients for that matter, if they're spending too much money on a drug that might, sort of offers the sort of possibility of a very limited benefit.
Thank you, Aaron. And just a follow-on question about this headline from the Medicare that plans to pay for Alzheimer's drug that win full FDA approval. So in case lecanemab gains it this summer, and where do the lecanemab and aducanumab fall in this? And what's going on with pricing, which are presented on this slide, about $28,000 per year for aducanumab and $26,000 for lecanemab, and the estimates of ICER, how much they should cost per year based on the clinical trial data?
Well, again, I love ICER, or I should say I appreciate ICER's work, but like ICER has no power. And they've got this nice little estimate, and it's they've got a lot of good data behind it. And if you're interested in it, they publish massive appendices of all the work that they do, and they do really solid work. But that doesn't matter. What matters is in the U.S. What matters is the price that the company sets, and that's what they're and Medicare also doesn't have any authority to negotiate drug prices except under the Inflation Reduction Act for drugs, after 9 to 13 years on the market for a small number, for subject to other exemptions as well. So, we're going to be in a situation where, the price is going to be what the company determines it wants the price to be, and that's just kind of where we are right now with drug pricing policy in the U.S. And so, I feel like there are things that we can do to talk about that, but I don't know that that's going to change anytime soon.
Thank you.
So I would add to that. I mean, the VA and Medicaid in the United States can negotiate prices, and private insurance doesn't necessarily have to follow Medicare. And in Europe, pricing is more involved in the regulatory environment. And I am not sure that the EMEA is going to approve this drug, or at least going to put more conditions on it than the FDA has done. So I think, and as Aaron said, the pricing is not just the drug, it's all the clinical time and the MRIs and all the other things that go along with it. So I do think the pricing is going to continue to be in the equation in the United States, but basically, Aaron was quite right. Medicare doesn't have the ability to really do that.
A very important comments, and very interesting to watch the space and Medicare's decision and how they're going to deal with their budget if they follow what they have stated on June 1st. So I'd like to go back to the question that we've had from Till Bruckner for Richard. So some have argued that approval of even clinically marginally effective AD drugs helps to encourage companies to stay in the AD research field, else they might give up on looking for effective treatments and we will never see effective drugs. What is your take on that? And I would be happy if others want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one. Obviously, I don't work in that industry. I mean, I hope that's not the case. I hope people are looking at where is the greatest need, and dementia is, I think, one of the biggest biomedical challenges we face. I hope people see that want to do that. Of course, that is not the only consideration in their mind, and there are others, and that may factor in if you've had no new treatment for 20 years in Europe, sticking now to in the US, and no disease modifying treatment ever. That is hard to keep on persuading people to invest the money in there, where there are a lot easier avenues actually to get through treatments in other conditions. But I have heard that from speaking to pharmaceutical colleagues in the UK, that their decisions are helping to encourage people to do that, as we are. But yeah, it's difficult for me to comment. I don't work in pharma industry, and I hope they are driven by the want to tackle this challenge as opposed to.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Peter another question. Let's assume these drugs get into clinical practice, or let's assume we had a drug with longer than 18 months and much more impressive improvement. From the clinical perspective, how are these drugs meant to be used in clinical practice? Because from clinical trials, we have data on 18 months. And patients should be taking these medications up until first adverse events, until clearance of amyloid plaques in their brain, until clearly documented disease progression. Do we have knowledge of that?
I don't think we have enough knowledge. The analysis of the CDR sum of boxes scores suggested that there are subtypes. For example, women did not seem to respond as well as men, and ApoE types. So there's a whole gamish of things we don't know. The labeling, apparently, if it's approved, will allow people in with certain kinds of blood thinners. But in general, the issue of should we be not giving these drugs to people that are on anticoagulants, for example. So the issue of whether we can stop these drugs if the amyloid is cleared, I think is also uncertain. It's one thing that's clear about these drugs is that they do clear amyloid. So should that be your endpoint, or should it be a clinical endpoint? These are all very good questions, and there will be practice guidelines that are coming out, and those are best estimates from people that have used medication in trials, usually. We need to follow those very carefully. But I do think, as usual, when you bring something out of the rarefied environment of trials, where people are very clearly a healthier population, into older folks that have more comorbidities, the dangers of this, the safety issues have not been adequately vented. And I'll say one last thing, which is kind of ironic. You know, we talk about brain swelling, which is ARIA, the amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. All these medications also cause brain atrophy, shrinkage of the brain out of proportion to any expectations you would have around the removal of amyloid. You could say, okay, if you remove amyloid, the brain's going to shrink a little bit. But in actual fact, looking puzzled, Lisa, but that has been in the background of all these compounds. What does it mean that the brain actually shrinks as the amyloid is being removed if you don't have ARIA? It's atrophy. So there's a lot we don't understand about safety, in my opinion.
Let me just sort of add on to that, and first of all, echo Dan Allendorf's comment based on our conversation earlier about whether or not drug companies are just going to give up, or researchers are just going to give up because a drug doesn't get approved for this field. I also think that really doesn't pass the smell test, because there are, in the US, there are 5 to 6 million people with Alzheimer's disease. There's massive unmet medical need in this area. And, there's a lot of public funding going into looking into new types of biomarkers and other pathways that cause Alzheimer's disease. And, I think that those are going to provide insights into treatment. So I don't see this. If there are people out there that are arguing that unless we approve these drugs, all innovation will stop, that seems like a relatively specious argument. But then I also want to just sort of say, piggyback a little bit on what Peter said, which is that I think it's going to be really important to, assuming that lecanemab does get approved, it's going to be really important to follow closely the experience of patients who receive the drug. And that may be what CMS does in the context of covering the drug, is cover the drug on the condition that patients enroll in a registry to follow their clinical course. Now, there are registries and there are registries, and my hope is that if that does happen and a registry is set up, that it is a very well managed and closely maintained registry that sort of keeps a close watch on patients on their clinical course and their side effects and outcomes, and to allow the government and physicians to respond quickly to it. But that sort of follow-up is going to be essential to get at some of these issues.
Thank you, Aaron.
If I could just,
Go ahead.
add quickly, phase 4, post-approval, is really critical. And this is a role that CMS could play in asking for these kinds of registries to be set up. Unfortunately, with most phase 4 studies, even when the FDA has required them, even when the post-marketing data has been collected and the drug's been demonstrated to be ineffective, the FDA has a very poor track record of actually removing drugs that they've asked for more data on, haven't been able to demonstrate that they're efficacious. So I think the FDA needs to, and the CMS need to beef up this post-approval monitoring process.
Thank you, Peter. The good comment, very interesting comment from Jack Scannell in the chat. And while you're reading it, I'd like to ask our panel the final question, mostly targeted to Frank and to Peter, but others obviously feel free to comment. All three drugs had quite similar clinical trials in their design. Are you happy with how they've been done? Besides, of course, stopping for the trials prematurely for aducanumab. But another question is, what trials would you like to see? Are there any chance, maybe it's a question for Aaron, that we can see further controlled trials if the drug gains full approval? Or are we lucky to rely on real world evidence in the future? So Frank, perhaps you can start.
Yeah, I'm not happy with the lack of respect for the raw data that's present in all of the analyses that I've seen. So I think the analyses could be a lot better. And I think the p-values that are quoted in the papers are not necessarily very accurate as a result of having data that doesn't meet the assumptions that are used in the analyses. In terms of design, I think the designs are pretty good, except there's a very common problem in clinical trials that people treat the sample size as a constant. And if you were to say which thing that is the design parameter needs to be treated as a random variable because of tremendous uncertainty of the outcome rates and standard deviations, the sample size is what should be treated as a random variable. We pretend that we can calculate a sample size and then we aim to complete that number of patients enrolled, whether it provides enough evidence or provides too much evidence. We have to move past that to more sequential and adaptive trials for efficiency and for more honesty in what the sample size ultimately needs to be.
Thank you, Frank. Peter, any comments on the trials or data that you would like to see on these drugs?
Well, what is interesting about some of these drugs is some of the secondary outcome measures were also positive. But I don't think we've looked at the relationships within the outcome measures and the amyloid imaging. In other words, do people who reduce their amyloid more get more clinical benefit? A critical question. My own focus on outcome measures has been activities of daily living and quality of life. I mean, I sometimes say the patients and families don't really care whether the doctor thinks the patient is better. The question is, what is the function? And Richard mentioned this, and there is some data. What's the functional improvements or less decline in functional disabilities, and how does that affect the quality of life of the patient and the family? That's what I would like to see more.
Thank you very much, Peter. Any final comments from Aaron and Richard?
Well, I think you had suggested something about whether we could see additional trials, and I think that would be ideal. Like if we had a healthcare system that would support that, and the drug would be approved, and people would continue to be enrolled in clinical trials would be ideal. And I think actually to go back to the COVID epidemic, as sort of early days of the COVID epidemic, that's the UK health system was great in helping identify some early interventions for COVID by virtue of having a system that could support sort of practical clinical trials in which people would be enrolled as they were presenting into the health system. We don't really have that in the US. And the signals that the FDA is giving off is suggesting that they're not going to require that CMS is giving off is that they're not going to require those kinds of additional trials, that they're going to require a registry, which is why I said it's going to be really important for that registry to be super duper well organized, and we'll have to see.
Be really quick, just to back. I mean, Aaron's point around the registry is so important. That's the only way we're going to know what's happening and improve in second generation. You mentioned about improvement on trials. The vast majority of these trials were white, and that is not the populations that wide. So are there going to be variants? We know Peter mentioned there may be differences in how women responded. Would there be differences in terms of ethnicity as well? I think we've got data to show that that's probably going to be the case sometimes. So we didn't get audiences or participants that were reflective of our societies. And I think that's something we need to make sure starts happening in the future.
Thank you very much to our experts for a very interesting conversation. We have a lot to look forward to, not just with decisions on these medications, but also on the research going on other targets and potential hope for doing something with this disease that changes this paradigm of failures that we've had so far.